Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 news. Excitement injected back into this year's F1 Championship with Charles Leclerc somehow taking a miraculous pole position for the Hungarian Grand Prix. It looked absolutely dominant for the McLarens all weekend long, but when it mattered in Q3, Leclerc delivered and the McLarens did not. Absolute chaos in this final qualifying session. The Aston Martins were up there. Russell was in P4, but half a tenth off pole position. Hamilton, Antonelli out earlier than they would like. Verstappen way down the order as well after a dramatic day with loads of upsets up and down the grid. What happened over these last couple of hours? We're going to get into it today. Very much into your thoughts and comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate it. We're going to begin with a couple of things on Ferrari because today was definitely a confusing one. This Ferrari SF25 continues to confound. There are occasions where it looks very competitive and very impressive, but getting the tyres in the right spot at the right time was proving very tricky today for both drivers. Leclerc made it to Q3, Hamilton did not. But even getting through Q1, Q2 was not an easy feat for either driver. But they did decide going into today that Hamilton would take a different approach. He had, as you guys can see here, clearly more downforce on the rear than Leclerc went for. Was that a good idea? It's a question because even Hamilton keeping that rear of the car under control in the final couple of corners was proving to be a serious challenge for him and that Ferrari today. We also had some interesting developments yesterday. This was Fred Vasseur walking into the Mercedes hospitality and people wondering, well, why? And then a few minutes later, here he is emerging with John Elkann from Mercedes hospitality. So what's going on there? What does this mean? What were they talking about? It's a good question. Is he just visiting Toto because he's a good friend? Probably wouldn't do that in the paddock with John Elkann, the president of Ferrari, trailing right behind him. So more than likely there was somewhat more to it than that. What could it have been? There is a theory, of course, that maybe they were talking about Bono. Maybe they were talking about sending Hamilton back and bringing Antonelli over. Like, yeah, it's not going to happen. But, my point is maybe there was some conversation around Pete Bonington, engineer for Hamilton. Although I will say that back in Spa, the communication between the two of them was actually far better. Getting to the decision of what they did when it was raining and when it stopped raining and putting Hamilton back to the medium tyres, the comms there were actually far better. So it feels like they're making some progress. And even if they were to want to get Bono and Hamilton wanted him to come over to the team or somebody else from Mercedes, it's unclear whether that would have been, whether that would really move the needle massively as it stands, and also whether they could even realistically do it. You want to get Bono, is there some sort of gardening leave period? He's also not just Antonelli's race engineer, he also has a wider role in the team, so there's plenty of moving parts, let's say, when it comes to that kind of decision. What's more likely, unfortunately more boring, but what is more likely is that they were talking about the upcoming power units, the new directions that they're looking to take with the sport, and likely they went to have a chat about something to that effect. So that's the rumour anyway. Maybe they talked about the new FIA president, maybe they talked about other things, who knows. But it's likely that they might talk about the engines and what's happening in 2026, and maybe about their relative competitive prospects on the weekend. So let's talk about how we got to today, because, wow, what a crazy day. This, by the way, Oscar Piastri, 1:14.9, that would have taken pole by basically half a second. And why it didn't, and why McLaren couldn't replicate that, is a very interesting question indeed. So during practice, Hamilton was looking pretty good, Leclerc was looking pretty good, the Ferraris looked like they were maybe going to be in the conversation. But as I said yesterday and in the pre-show, it just felt, even if Lando didn't do a good lap, even if Piastri didn't do a good lap, it felt like there was no way that anyone was really going to be able to put it in between those two. Like, let's say Lando wanted to be on pole, obviously, but he would probably like, as would Piastri, to have another driver between himself and their teammate. But it didn't seem very likely, right? The feeling was that today was a fight for third place on the grid. And it certainly felt that way in FP3, because Piastri just decided to bolt on a new set of softs and set a 1:14.9, purple, purple, purple. Then Lando went out and put in a 1:14.9, which was, again, right, it was 300 off where Piastri was. They were absolutely neck and neck. Hamilton was nearly a second back, and then Stroll put in a lap to go 9/10 off the pace. And look, Stroll, Alonso, Aston Martin, what are we cooking right now? Like, what are they cooking over there? Because they've clearly brought some changes this weekend and things are finally starting to click. It's actually remarkable today how close the gap was for pole position. and as a result, how close it is further down the order, because Lance Stroll today was a 10th off pole, but yet he was really nowhere near the front row, and we'll get to exactly how all that played out here in a second. But this was the end of FP1, or FP3, sorry. Antonelli put in a lap that looked solid enough. There was some optimism around Antonelli maybe getting back to Russell's pace or somewhere similar this weekend, a track that should suit him relatively well. But this was, again, towards the end of the session, Max Verstappen, before those fast laps came through, saying, look, you try and fix the rear, the car goes into understeer, it's an absolute nightmare, this machine. And there was even a couple of comments that he made on the radio, and it seems that what he said is, well, GP asked him, how's the limitation on the car, where is the limitations? And he says, rear grip, low speed, and high speed. GP then says, okay, thank you, and Max cuts him off and says, I'm not done, that's not the only issues, we've got issues everywhere, but when he's saying that the rear isn't gripping, we've got low speed problems, we've got high speed problems, and I'm not done. The car is very stiff. There's not a lot of compliance at the rear. So just an absolute mess of a car. And Yuki was not happy either, because at the end of the session, he was like, what a session, for a few reasons. It wasn't just because the car was a struggle, but also, again, the way that Red Bull handled it from the pit wall. There were a couple of moments that Yuki just wasn't happy with their execution. He was telling the pit wall, like, wake up, guys, what are you playing at? I'm sure he's having some flashback to when he was at AlphaTauri, and their strategy and their communication was not particularly strong. I imagine he expected to join Red Bull, and that part of things would be far better, but it has not been the case at all. So FP3 ends, and it was Piastri, Norris from Leclerc. So Leclerc got within 4 tenths, but even then, I mean, that lap time from Leclerc would have been good enough for pole, wouldn't it? And, pretty much that's what he did a couple of hours later. The reasons for that are fascinating, and we'll get through them in a second. But Max was P12, Yuki was P19, right? The Red Bull was looking like a real handful. And honestly, Max's final run to try and make it, and just interesting to note here, I know lots of these top speeds are relatively similar, but Stroll was up at 324 during qualifying. Leclerc was up at 323, and Hamilton further down, of course, running more rear wing on the car, gave Leclerc and Stroll and Alonso a bit of an edge maybe over their McLaren counterparts that were not expected to be their counterparts. But as the qualifying session transpired, it was all rather competitive. So qualifying gets underway, and they were sitting at about a 1:15.5. The track conditions were at this point getting better all the time. The conditions were cooling down. The cooler the track got, the faster the times were going to be. But as you guys can see on the left-hand side here, Verstappen put in a 1:16.3, and Yuki was just, a tenth, 1.8 or so tenths behind at a 1:16.5, which is, it's very frustrating how it's working out for Yuki. And I know that people say, well, you just got to get better. And I do adopt that mentality too, to some degree. But still, we know how amazingly good Max Verstappen is. And yet, this weekend, that car was absolutely nowhere. Red Bull simply have not been able to get on top of it at all. Cars or tracks that require higher downforce, the Red Bull has been nowhere for a long time now, and we saw it here last year as well, where Max had an absolutely torrid race and he was fuming on the radio, as I'm sure you guys probably well remember. But when's the last time they were really good at a circuit with lots of downforce? It's been a long time ago, and when there's not many high-speed corners, and even to be fair, through the high-speed corners, the Red Bull didn't look very good here either. So the Red Bull was a nightmare, clearly, to drive. Max had all sorts of issues with it, and Yuki has pretty much the same car this weekend with the upgrades that are on it, and Yuki was closer than any Red Bull driver has been to Max in a very long time. It's been a long time since any Red Bull driver has really been, within a tenth and a half, 2 tenths of Max. Usually it's far more than that. Yuki, with the confidence that he's gained recently, was actually basically there with Max this weekend. And on a weekend where the Red Bull was strong, Yuki probably would have comfortably been into Q3. But unfortunately for Yuki, it just wasn't to be. So this is how it transpired. I mean, Max did his lap, and they did it early. And I will say that Red Bull, and maybe Mercedes as well, with the way they handle Antonelli, will have to think about the timings here, because they sent their drivers out quite early. That gives you an advantage. You send your drivers out early, less traffic, less impeding. fewer things to worry about. But equally, you get worse track conditions, and that was critical in Q1 today. So Russell got pretty close, Antonelli got pretty close to where the McLarens were. Then we saw, with a few minutes to go, Alonso put in a 1:15.2. Purple, purple, purple he went. And I don't know what they've done with that Aston Martin, because in Spa, they weren't very good, but they brought some more tweaks. They seem to have actually delivered an upgrade package, which actually works. Is it Adrian Newey magic? Possibly, we don't know. All we know is that in the last couple of months, if you tell Newey about 2025, as in this year, he'll tell you to shut up and he'll go and hide in his hole and he'll go back to his drawing board. Because the rumour is that he refuses to talk about this year and he's fully focused on next year. But it is plausible that when he joins the team initially, he at least had a look at what they were planning. There's rumours anyway that Newey came in and he was like, okay, these are their upgrade plans for the year. And maybe Newey said, okay, maybe you want to try this, try that. And then those things have finally arrived at the track a couple of months down the line. And maybe we're seeing the outcomes of that. Maybe Newey wasn't involved at all, and they've just cooked up something pretty impressive. But yeah, Aston Martin, where did they come from this weekend? And also, I mean, Alonso could have had pole today. Stroll could have had pole today, right? Like, it was genuinely there in Q3, as remarkable as that sounds. But as Q1 continues, we get the Red Bulls go out quite early. And Max went P6 he was 0.5 off Piastri, and Tsunoda was 1.5 off Verstappen. At the time, that was P8, but there was still 1:10 to go and the rest of the lap to complete, and everyone just got shuffled down to the point where Liam Lawson came through, put it into P14, was still about 0.3 off where Hadjar was. It wasn't exactly a great lap, but it was enough, and it put Tsunoda out of qualifying. Gasly was out, which is good for Colapinto, actually really big for Colapinto, because just for him to have a solid weekend is a big deal for him at the moment after some recent struggles. Hülkenberg was out again. I will say, right, I mean, this is what confused me when Tomo did that tier ranking of drivers this season, and Hülkenberg was somehow second or third. His qualifying really this year has not been that good. It's just he had the podium in Silverstone, so I get there's some recency bias in play. Albon was out as well, so big result in many respects for Sainz. But look at the gaps here, look at the competition, absolutely mega. But Yuki was out. I mean, yeah, it is tough, isn't it, right? Like, Yuki's just joined the team at a time where the car is now atrocious, and even though he's closer to Max than anyone has been in a very, very long time, that was him out in P16. And it's like Max finished qualifying today in a position where tomorrow he's going to be fighting for the minor points. You know, potentially that's where he qualified, right? So if Max is qualifying there, good luck to any of his teammates. So it's just very tough for Yuki, because this is defining for his career. Had he joined when the car was better, then maybe it would have been very different. But, you know, for him to keep his drive, for him to keep his spot, even in Formula One, will probably depend on what Red Bull do over the coming weeks and whether they can find a way to improve. Q2 gets underway. Norris, 1:14.8. The fastest we'd seen anyone go on the weekends. Super impressive lap. Piastri got within 0.5, but, you know, wasn't able to pip it. Both Ferraris here were on the struggle bus. They put on old tyres. Leclerc was 1.3 seconds off. Hamilton was 1.3 seconds off. And then the final run started to come through. Leclerc was like, guys, just don't send me out when I'm going to get into traffic, which is pretty much what they did. And Leclerc put in a lap that was, I mean, it was crazy, right? Leclerc put in a lap that was nearly 0.6 off Norris. He made it through. Hamilton was a couple of tenths further back with, yeah, he was having a tough time out there, right? And it's just so strange, that Ferrari, right? And obviously Hamilton's going to blame himself, and we'll see that in a second. And it's remarkable the difference between, you know, Hamilton is the best driver in the history of this track, right? Like, he's been on pole here 9 times. He's won here so many times. And he turns up this weekend. Leclerc says it's his worst track of the season. He somehow sticks it on pole, and Hamilton's a couple of tenths off him in this qualifying session. And yeah, it was not a great lap for Hamilton. His rear tyres were giving up on him the last couple of corners. Didn't seem, I don't know, especially confident on the throttle sometimes to get the rear underneath him. And Leclerc's a couple of tenths up the road, but it's not like Leclerc was insanely rapid and Hamilton was totally nowhere in this session. It really feels like getting that Ferrari in the right window is just such a challenge, and sometimes they get it right and sometimes it's nowhere. And, you know, who knows if Hamilton made it to Q3, maybe he would have been the one somehow sticking it on pole. Doubtful, just because Leclerc is that guy, right? But and, you know, Hamilton was that guy and maybe still in there somewhere, but, you know, not, we've seen that obviously not in qualifying as of late. So Hamilton goes out Very frustrated, understandably, with his individual performance. He was, we can see him afterwards, deeply frustrated with this performance, saying that he's just useless, drove terribly. This is obviously classic Hamilton, like he's just had a poor performance type. This is what he does, right? Like he gets very down. He always wears his heart on his sleeve like this. So not massively surprised by the comment. I think obviously he's very frustrated at it. When he comes back and looks at it, he'll probably think, damn, like that's so frustrating. But also it's not like Leclerc was miles up the road, he was a couple of tenths further up the road. That was enough to make it through to Q3 and then give them the opportunity to take advantage of what presented itself, which were rather dramatic changes in conditions. Now, this was Q3, but actually just before we get there, Antonelli was kicked out of qualifying as well. He had a pretty scruffy lap and he didn't make it through either. So again, Antonelli and Hamilton with pretty shocking times in their qualifying sessions. Both Racing Bulls, again, make it through into Q3, which is very commendable from those guys. And then we get Q3 underway. Max is doing an outlap and says, I've got no grip. It's literally like driving on ice. And in the last sector, the tyres still die, which I thought was pretty funny. But early on here, Piastri did a 1:15.3, Norris had a pretty scruffy lap, only a 1:15.4. This was because the wind direction had changed. That's what the McLaren drivers said, that effectively the wind was going in the total opposite direction to what it was previously, and it slowed down everyone dramatically. But it seemed to speed up the Aston Martins and Charles Leclerc. Now, notably, this lap from George Russell, he was 2 tenths off, but he was purple, and the McLarens are mighty through the final sector because they hold on to the tyres, but he had a big snap at the final corner, probably cost him a tenth and a half, maybe 2 tenths. It probably wouldn't have been enough for pole, but it might well have been enough for Russell to sneak a front row here had he got that first lap in. But even you can see Max, right, is already half a second down on Piastri through the first couple of sectors. Then the Aston Martins came out. Stroll had a great lap cooking. Alonso went one better. So Alonso actually put it between both of the McLarens here for P2 at the time, which was unbelievable. And Stroll was P4, but only a tenth off where Piastri was. Max then comes over the line and only puts it P8. He was only 3.5 tenths away, but Leclerc, a 1:15.3. No one was even looking at Leclerc. We were watching the McLarens struggle, go yellow, right? Like, they just didn't put it together, the drivers nor the team. It felt like they should be untouchable, and they went 1:14.8 in the previous qualifying session, but Leclerc just kept on getting better and better, knocking some time away. Piastri couldn't improve, Norris did, but it wasn't enough. Russell will be pretty gutted because he put in a time that was really impressive, honestly. Like, his lap was half a tenth off pole and he was only P4. Then the two Aston Martins locking out the third row, a tenth off pole between them. Like, what a crazy qualifying session. Bortoletto's 7th was just absolutely mega in the Sauber. Like, what a drive to be ahead of Max. Honestly incredible. There's a big battle this year for who's the rookie of the year so far. Bortoletto is definitely making a case over the last few rounds. And then Lawson qualifies Hadjar by a tenth, which is a pretty big deal as well. But how did this even happen? How was Charles Leclerc somehow able to get pole position? And you can see what happens here, right? This is the breakdown of the qualifying session where the two McLarens were. Pretty much all weekends, they were clear of the rest of the field, but in the final part of qualifying, they were all in a line, and it was Leclerc who somehow gets ahead of them. So that's massive for tomorrow's race. We know that it's great around here for qualifying. Hungary doesn't always produce the best Grand Prix. I think it's entertaining generally, but it's not easy to overtake around here, certainly if there's no rain for Bottas to go bowling in, or whatever you want to say. And what does this mean for tomorrow? Because in terms of race pace, we weren't really looking at the race pace data too much, because we didn't really think it'd be so relevant. And maybe it won't be. Maybe Leclerc will be a sitting duck, right? And the McLarens will be far too strong. I think it's pretty likely. But could Leclerc defend from the McLarens like Max did back in Suzuka? Like he did from Max back in Spa? Maybe it's not impossible. And if Leclerc's leading out of turn 1, tomorrow's race could get very interesting. It also means that McLaren, just hypothetically, might have a very interesting decision to make. Let's say both of their drivers are behind Leclerc and maybe Russell's kind of close behind them. Who do they pit first? What's the strategy call in that sense? Look, do I think the McLaren are going to win the race tomorrow? Yes. But who wins the race and from where? That's a big question. And could Leclerc manage to do something miraculous? Maybe. If Hamilton was in the mix, maybe Ferrari have a better time of things. Look, Hamilton, as I said, he got into, as always, this very down state. He actually made some really strong statements here. The team have no problem. You've seen the cars on pole, so we probably need to change driver, he says. And he actually, I think, doubled down on that as well and says the team probably needs to change driver. The other cars on pole, I'm absolutely useless. So, I mean, look, it's obviously tough, Hamilton, because yeah, it's obviously a stinker, right? Especially because this track he would have hoped to be on the podium here because it's been such a good track for him historically. I think there's a bit more nuance to the situation, but yeah, it's undeniable that the potential is there in the car sometimes. It's just Hamilton's been unable to extract that as often as Leclerc has this season. So very much interested in your thoughts on the comments. What's going to happen tomorrow? Hamilton will probably come back tomorrow and be, his much more fighting self, but we do see this sometimes from Lewis, and it's definitely painful for him. And it's a difficult day when both McLarens, don't maximise, and yet he's not in position to capitalise on that as his teammate was. So very much interested in your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.